In 1831, a group of escaped enslaved people traveling the Underground Railroad reported being guided by a woman of immense stature who moved through the forest like a creature carved of shadow and bark. They said she knew the marshes intimately, that she asked only, "Have you heard of a boy named Jacob?" In 1835, a plantation overseer in northern Georgia swore he had seen a giant woman at the edge of his fields at dusk. When he attempted to confront her, he said she lifted him by the lapels of his coat with one hand, set him on the ground like a child, and disappeared into the trees. In 1842, a Quaker woman in Ohio wrote in her diary of a visitor, "A woman taller than any I had seen, bearing old wounds, searching for a son sold long ago." She stayed one night. At dawn, she was gone. Were these encounters real? Were they stories grown in the wet soil of longing and fear? The record can't give an answer, and yet the consistency is uncanny. Tall, scarred, searching. A woman who vanished with the same ease with which she had appeared. Planters whispered of thefts in the night. Food, blankets, tools missing, footprints too large to be a man's. Overseers swore they saw a figure standing still at tree lines, watching. Plantation owners wrote in diaries of a woman so tall she seemed carved from the woods themselves. The rumors thickened into a presence. Songs grew around her name, songs sung softly, half-coded, always in the places where no overseer walked. Among black communities, she became a protector, a vengeful mother, an omen that the system itself could not escape judgment. Among whites, she became a monster story to terrify their children and justify harsher rule. Tall Sarah, the swamp woman, the child thief, the giant who crushed men with her bare hands. The truth was more human, more haunted, and far more tragic. By 1860, the legend had overtaken the woman, and by the end of the Civil War, Sarah had become a shadow stitched into several unseen histories, passed between generations in half-remembered tales told at night. But in 1889, long after the world that birthed her had collapsed, another small thread surfaced. A Philadelphia physician, Dr. Robert Hayes, treated an elderly black woman who, in her final days, spoke of her mother. A woman of extraordinary stature who had escaped bondage after killing her owner in South Carolina. A woman who had wandered for years looking for a lost son. A woman who had finally settled in Pennsylvania under a different name. She died, the daughter said, in 1867. Dr. Hayes wrote the story in a letter, part astonishment, part dismissal. He did not record the old woman's name. He did not attempt to verify her story. The letter, almost forgotten, was found more than a century later in a box of unrelated papers. Was it Sarah's daughter? Was any of it true? The evidence is too thin to stand unchallenged, but the coincidence is haunting. And then there is the boy she never saw again. Jacob Hafford, raised in Savannah as a house servant, grew to adulthood. After emancipation, he became a carpenter, perhaps unknowingly echoing the work of his father. He lived until 1891. He married. He had children. In interviews conducted in the 1930s, Jacob's descendants said he possessed a small wooden horse he kept his entire life. Carved, he claimed, by his father Marcus. He named his eldest daughter Sarah. It is the closest thing history gives us to a full circle. So what happened to Sarah Drummond? The documented truth ends on the night her blood trail disappeared into the swamp. The rest belongs to speculation and story, to letters without names, to shadowed testimonies, to rumors that outlived those who whispered them. The most rational explanation is that she died of her wound within days. But legends do not cling to rationality. They cling to longing, to dread, to the need for symbols when facts fail. Yet one thing remains certain. The giant woman of Marsh Bend was real. She lived, she suffered, she resisted. And on an August night in 1827, she crossed the line between what a human being can endure and what a human spirit will do when nothing remains to lose. Her body vanished, but her story remained. Half history, half haunting, etched into the mud and memory of the Lowcountry, where even now some say her ghost walks the tree lines at dusk, still looking for the boy taken from her arms. While the magistrate questioned everyone at Marsh Bend, silence reigned in the quarters. Fear sealed lips. But slowly, testimonies emerged. Hesitant, careful, shaped by the knowledge that words could be punished. They revealed a plantation wound tight with cruelty. The exhibitions, the punishments, the sale of the child. Ruth recounted the scene in the library with her voice trembling. Isaac the butler confirmed he heard the shot and saw blood on the kitchen doorframe. Others whispered of the years of humiliation Sarah had suffered and the fragile thread of hope that had existed only in the shape of her child. The gunshot complicated everything. Plantation law was absolute. Enslaved people had no legal right to self-defense against their owners. But the fact that Crane had shot Sarah first had wounded her, hung in the room during every deposition like a candle guttering in wind. Men who had built their lives on maintaining a rigid hierarchy began to look uncomfortable. The record says they pressed on, but the sense that something had slipped out of their grasp lingered. Marcus, still barely conscious, was interrogated repeatedly. His back was an open wound. He could hardly sit upright. The men questioning him wanted to believe he knew where Sarah had gone. He insisted he had been in his cabin, unable to move. Several people confirmed it. Suspicion remained, but no proof. The search parties grew, then shrank. Men rode miles through the Lowcountry, along the creeks and cane-choked marshes, calling her name as though she might answer. Dogs were brought. Riders combed the forests, but the land gave nothing back. Each night the darkness swallowed their torches whole. By the end of August, the political and emotional temperature in Charleston had changed. News traveled quickly among the planters, and the story of Crane's death spread like wildfire through dry brush. His death had been brutal, but it was the nature of the killer that sent unease through the region. A woman who had endured punishment that would have broken men, who had stood silent through exhibitions, who could lift what others could not, and who had finally turned that strength against her owner. Fear moved through drawing rooms and parlors. Emergency meetings were called. Patrols doubled, restrictions tightened. Rumors swirled about rebellion, supernatural creatures, omens in the swamp. Some simply whispered that the violence was the natural culmination of a system strained too far. But in other corners, in alleys, in kitchens, in the small gatherings of free black families, the story transformed. Sarah became something else, a name that traveled in murmurs, a warning and a hope, a symbol of endurance in a place built on erasing names. Children were cautioned in the quarters. Be strong like her, but beware her road. Mothers whispered prayers to a God who might have seen Sarah's suffering. Fathers whispered admiration in moments of secrecy. The legend expanded, breathed, shed its skin, and then came the letter. It arrived without ceremony at the Charleston magistrate's office in mid-September, left anonymously at a post office in Columbia. The handwriting was crude, the words plain, but the message was unmistakable. I am not dead. I will never return. I am going north, to find my son. If any man tries to stop me, he will meet the same fate as Josiah Crane. No signature, no detail about where she was or how she had survived the wound. The letter made its way through restricted channels, seen only by officials and a few slave traders. It had the ring of authenticity, details unpublicized, the stark cadence of someone who understood pursuit. Magistrate Huger believed it was her. Others believed it was a ruse meant to provoke fear. But even the most skeptical noted that it referenced events that had never reached public ears. Gadsden, the trader who had purchased Jacob, was summoned and interrogated. His details were precise, even smug. He confirmed selling Jacob 2 days after leaving Marsh Bend to a respectable family in Savannah, the Haffords. They were contacted and confirmed the child was in their care, healthy, living under watch. They had heard of the killing. They had heard of the disappearance, and they were terrified. By the winter of 1827, the search had effectively ended. Patrols still rode out occasionally. Notices still hung in certain corners of Charleston. But no one truly believed she remained in the Lowcountry. The landscape had swallowed her, or she had moved beyond its reach. But rumors are a kind of afterlife, and Sarah did not stay buried in silence. What came afterward unfolded along 2 tracks: the practical, prosaic business of law and the myth that withers into stories. The coroner's examination, cold and obedient to detail, would later describe a compression of the skull inconsistent with ordinary human hands. It catalogued the blood and bone and the pistol lodged in the wall. Testimony from Ruth, from Isaac the butler, from Overseer Grimble, and from other enslaved people painted a picture of Sarah as both victim and agent, brutalized by public lashings, humiliated by exhibit, and driven to the edge by the sale of her child. Yet other threads pulled outward from Marsh Bend. Letters arrived, one left anonymously at a post office in Columbia, declaring, in crude, unflinching handwriting, that Sarah was not dead and would travel north to find her son, and that any who followed would meet the same fate as Crane. Sightings were reported along roads and riverbanks, a woman of monstrous height at a church door in the back country, a figure slipping through tree lines at dusk, escaped enslaved people who swore a giant had guided them. Traders and planters cataloged these claims as threats or superstition. Free black communities kept them like lanterns of hope. None of the sightings could be substantiated, yet the letter itself proved a puzzle. It referenced details not yet public, which suggested either Sarah had survived long enough to write, or someone else, familiar with the plantation's intimate griefs, wrote to inflame the hunt. By September, the active search had waned into a wider, anxious watchfulness. Rewards were posted. The Havford family in Savannah, the purchasers of Jacob, tightened their guard around the child. The magistrates debated whether an enslaved person could claim self-defense when the law considered them property. Plantation owners tightened patrols. In the quarters, songs and whispers braided around Sarah as symbol, a mother, a monster, an avenger, a spirit of the swamp. There is a tidy, rational account many historians have offered since. Sarah, wounded by a pistol ball, likely succumbed to infection in the swamps within days, her body consumed by the elements. It explains the abrupt ending of the blood trail and the absence of confirmed sightings. It is plausible. It is sober. Yet the story refuses to sit neat. Letters arrive from far places. Diary entries years later report a giant figure watching from tree lines. A dying woman in Pennsylvania would later claim a mother like Sarah had found refuge in the north. The evidence thins, frays, and fans into rumor. But what is indisputable? The ledger lines that cannot be argued away. remains compact and brutal. Josiah Crane lay dead in his library on August 14, 1827. His skull crushed by hands, described as larger and stronger than those any ordinary man might possess. And the woman who was seen leaving that house by a trail of blood and swamp was never found. In the weeks following her disappearance, the official investigation creaked forward with the slow, uneasy gait of men trying to impose order on something that felt older and darker than law. Magistrate William Huger arrived at Marsh Bend with deputies and Dr. James Pellow, the physician assigned to examine the remains. The plantation was quiet when they came, quiet in the way of places where violence has recently passed through, leaving the air hollowed out. Dr. Pellow's report, preserved in the Charleston archives, is clinical and strangely reverent in its dryness. He described Crane's injuries with restrained horror. A skull collapsed inward by massive compression force, fractured in multiple places, blood forced outward in a spray that reached the shelves. The impressions left on the bone, elongated, wide, asymmetrical, matched no tool, no improvised weapon. They suggested hands, very large hands, pressure applied with an intensity no ordinary body should contain. For Dr. Pellow, the conclusion was an unsettling glimpse into the physical reality of the woman everyone thought they knew only as a curiosity or a threat. What follows is the part of the story that rests in the mouths of those who would remember, and in the official pages that do not tell everything. Peter, a boy sent to fetch water but hiding near a woodpile, would later give the most direct report of that conversation. Gadsden offered $400 for Jacob and proposed to take the baby that very afternoon. Crane hesitated, needing the cash. For the circle of those who lived in the quarters, the logic was mercilessly clear. Crane needed money. A child's sale answered ledgers faster than conscience. That night, Sarah and Marcus spoke in whispers into the dark. They made a decision that belonged to the kind of desperation only owners could create. Marcus slipped away at dawn, carrying a crude map stitched into his coat and a letter to any sympathetic hand in Charleston, pleading for help to stop the sale. His plan was hopelessly brave. He was caught. Returning 8 miles from Marsh Bend, he was snared by patrols, dogs tearing at him. He came back bloodied and broken. Crane ordered him stripped and bound at the whipping post. The lash fell 50 times. Those lashes were not merely punishment. They were an assertion of ownership broadcast to every body gathered to watch. Sarah stood before it all. Jacob pressed to her, watching a man who had been her partner reduced to flayed flesh. When Marcus was dragged back to his pallet, barely conscious, Crane's threatened him again, and the child will go, hung in the air like a verdict. The next morning brought, for a terrible few hours, a theater of the plantation's logic. Gadsden arrived to complete the purchase. Papers exchanged hands. Cash was counted. Crane sent for Sarah to deliver her son. She walked to the main house carrying Jacob, and everyone who watched remembered the strange calm in her movement. Inside the library, Sarah, a mountain of a woman in a small, bright room, begged. She begged with a voice so quiet people strained to hear. She pressed the infant into Crane's and Gadsden's hands and asked, like a supplicant at the foot of a ledger, for what no ledger ever accounted: mercy. The exchange occurred. Cash for child. Gadsden and his buyer left with Jacob wailing beneath a blanket. What unfolded in the library that evening, within minutes of that transaction, is documented by the few who dared to speak afterward. Ruth, a house servant, and the overseer were present. Crane, perhaps believing he had performed the correct commerce, sat with a pistol in his desk. Sarah stood at the doorway, blood-stained from something the night before, an image huge enough to rewrite the room's scale. She asked for her son back. Crane refused. He reached for the pistol. He fired, a shot that tore muscle and bone from Sarah's shoulder. The ball struck true, but she did not fall. She took the pistol from him as easily as one takes a toy, flung it aside, and then the thing any rational ledger could not predict happened. With hands that had long bent to toil and been bent by the lash, she took hold of Josiah Crane's head. What Ruth described later was precise, and the words steady even as they trembled. The sound of a skull collapsing like a pumpkin. A thump. A silence. When others burst into the room a short time later, Crane lay crumpled beside his mahogany desk, his skull crushed inward with such force that splinters and bone streaked the surface. The pistol lay where she had thrown it. A trail of blood marked her passage through the house and out toward the swamp. Beyond that, the darkness swallowed everything. The search that followed was immediate but muddled. Marsh Bend became a scene of hot feet and torches. Men with dogs picked through hummocks and ditches. The blood trail led to the tree line, then simply stopped. Swamps do what they do. Wet, tangled, greedy. And in that swallowing, an absence took on shape. They found nothing that first night. No body, no garments, no trace beyond the brief stain of loss. Men returned at dawn, exhausted and empty-handed, and the plantation's authority had to be reconstructed. A wagon sped to Charleston to fetch magistrates. Patrols and rumors multiplied. The first serious, undeniable rupture between owner and owned occurred in the summer of 1824, about 15 months after Sarah's arrival. A Charleston showman, Augustus Peaton, proposed to pay Crane $300 to take Sarah to the city for a 2-week exhibition of curiosities. Crane agreed. He expected compliance. He expected obedience. What he did not expect was refusal. When told of the plan, Sarah looked at Crane and said very quietly, "I will not go." Crane was stunned. She had never refused an order before. He repeated the command. She repeated the refusal. Porter Grimble and several men were summoned. They tried to force her to the whipping post. She did not fight so much as stop, a living, immovable force. It took 8 men, ropes, threats against others, and finally brute pulling to get her in motion. The punishment was carried out, 30 lashes with a braided leather whip. Witnesses said she made no sound as blood soaked through her dress. When it was over, she walked back to the cabin alone, her back shredded, posture unbowed. She did not go to Charleston. Crane, stung and embarrassed, invented an excuse about illness and canceled the exhibition. But the balance at Marsh Bend had shifted. The quarters had seen that Crane could wound her and that she could make him back down. For Crane, the humiliation stayed with him. For the enslaved community, it was a small, tremulous sign that defiance had been possible. An uneasy equilibrium followed. Crane continued to exhibit her to visitors, but stopped trying to remove her from the plantation. Punishments continued, but less frequently, as if each lash diminished his authority rather than reinforcing it. Beneath that fragile routine, something darker began to gather, patient as marsh fog, something that would, 3 summers later, break into a violence none at Marsh Bend could have unmade. In the spring of 1826, that slow pressure finally found its focal point. Sarah was pregnant. News on a plantation moves like a current. Quiet, precise, inevitable. Word passed through the cabins with the same economy as the river's tide. Marcus, a quiet carpenter who had arrived at Marsh Bend 2 years earlier, became the unlikely center of that small world. He had lost a wife and a child to sales years before. He knew how fragile family could be beneath the ledger lines and ledgers of planters. What grew between him and Sarah was not spectacle, but something closer to partnership, a shared breathing space in a life otherwise owned by other people. Marcus carved small toys. Sarah listened to his stories of places beyond her memory. When she learned the child within her was his, the quarters felt for a brief and terrible hour a possibility. Pregnancy on a rice plantation could be mercy and hazard folded into one. A child meant lineage, a continuity no slaveholder could wholly sever. It also meant another soul to be bought and sold, another way to extract profit from bodies. Crane saw only the accounting. He spoke openly of the infant's potential, its size, its market value, musing to visitors that such a child might command a high price when old enough to sell. The thought of her son paraded, exhibited, or trafficked because of Crane's calculation, of a baby used as an asset, shrank something inside Sarah into a cold, tight thing. She worked through the early months as expected, though the other women saw her pause in the fields, hand pressed to the small of her back. By November, the pregnancy made field labor impossible. She was reassigned to lighter tasks. Even in reduced work, she remained an imposing presence. Servants said she blocked the doorway when she stood at the kitchen. The winter's labor yielded its most human, tender hour in late January 1827. A harsh night, one of the coldest that region had known, found Sarah in labor, attended by 2 older women who midwifed for the plantation. The birth was brutal. Sarah, who had not cried at a lash, screamed then. She gave birth to a son, Jacob, an infant so large he startled those who held him. For a few weeks, Cabin 7 was a thin, fragile sanctuary. Marcus carved a cradle and tiny wooden animals. Sarah, whose hands had been used for lifting and punishment, held her son with a tenderness that belied the way others had only ever seen her moved. But the fragility of sanctuary was the plantation's purpose: to make private things public, to turn family into ledger entries. Crane's financial web tightened in the summer of 1827. Bad investments, the caprice of markets, the constant drain of rice cultivation left him vulnerable. By July, his debts pressed like claws. The solution he saw was familiar and bleak: sell people. A trader named Nathaniel Gadsden arrived in August, inspecting workers, measuring muscle and age like crude tomes. Gadsden circled Sarah while she worked the kitchen garden with Jacob slung against her back. He asked, not with curiosity but with transaction, "How much for the child?" The purchaser was Josiah Crane, owner of Marsh Bend, a rice plantation about 18 miles southwest of Charleston. Crane was 42, a widower, a man reputed among his peers to be exacting and ruthless, someone who took pride in enforcing order and who had little patience for softness among the enslaved. As Sarah was led away, her wrists marked with Crane's brand around a leather collar, witnesses said she made no sound. She did not cry, did not struggle. She only stared straight ahead with dark, unreadable eyes. No one present could have known they were watching the opening scene of a story that would end in blood and a disappearance that would feed rumor for generations. Perhaps they should have suspected something, for as Crane guided her to his wagon, an old free black woman selling flowers near the market whispered to a neighbor, "That man just bought his own death." Marsh Bend itself was a concise, merciless illustration of the Lowcountry's economy. A Georgian main house with white columns and a wide veranda watching over miles of rice paddies. Behind it, the kitchen building, overseer's cottage, barn, rice mill, and a row of a dozen slave cabins, rough-hewn structures with packed earth floors and no glass in the windows. The rice fields spread outward, an engineered landscape of dikes, ditches, and floodgates to manage the tides. When Sarah arrived at Marsh Bend in late March, she was assigned to cabin number 7, sharing cramped space with 5 other women. The overseer, a thin, nervous man named Porter Grimble, was visibly unnerved by her size. In a surviving letter to his brother in Columbia, he described her as a being that must stoop to enter the cabin, and as some ancient colossus more than a Christian woman. But Josiah Crane had not paid $1,300 merely for labor. Within a week, he began to exhibit Sarah to visitors. He invited neighboring planters and Charlestonians to Marsh Bend expressly to see what he had acquired. Sarah would be brought into the parlor or to the veranda and ordered to demonstrate her size, lifting barrels of rice, hauling iron anvils, hoisting full-grown pigs. Crane made a display of scale, standing beside her so visitors could watch the grotesque contrast. Men would place their hands inside hers and stare. A Charleston physician, Dr. Edmund Portier, recorded his own disquiet in a diary entry from May 1823. He measured her at 6.5 feet, possibly more, and recorded watching her lift a barrel of rice he estimated at 300 pounds with apparent ease. He confessed that the sight produced an unsettling sensation, as if nature herself had been experimenting with proportions beyond the normal boundaries of the human form. When she was not a curiosity, Sarah labored. Rice cultivation was backbreaking. 10 to 12 hours standing in brackish water, bent over in heat and mosquitoes, threatened by snakes and the fatigue that turned men and women into casualties of the swamp. Her size made her both indispensable and conspicuous. She could carry loads that took 2 or 3 ordinary workers. She could swing the heavy pestles used to thresh rice with a speed that astonished Overseer Grimble. But visibility is vulnerability. When Crane desired an example to enforce discipline, he often chose Sarah, not because she was guilty of any specific offense, but because punishing a body as large as hers sent a clearer message than punishing someone smaller. The punishments were savage and public. The whipping post, the stocks, the buck, a device that immobilized a person in excruciating position for hours. Records in Grimble's letters mention at least 3 occasions in Sarah's first year when she was publicly punished for perceived insolence or refusal to be exhibited. Yet she did not break into the compliant shape Crane expected. Testimony collected years later paints a different portrait. A woman both feared and relied upon by the enslaved community. She moved floodgates, hauled timber, carried exhausted workers to cabins. She stood between a whip and a child and took the blows. She spoke rarely. When she did, her voice was low and steady, carrying an authority that contradicted her status as property. Some in the quarters called her Tall Sarah, or simply the Wall. Once she planted herself, nothing moved her except force. And for a man like Crane, force alone might soon prove insufficient. On the morning of August 14, 1827, in the humid hush of the rice plantations that ringed Charleston, South Carolina, a man named Josiah Crane was found dead in his library. His skull had been crushed with a force so absolute that physicians later noted splinters of bone embedded in the mahogany desk 6 feet away. The coroner's report, preserved in the Charleston County Archives, describes injuries consistent with compression by hands of extraordinary size and strength, fingers wider than normal, pressure concentrated in a pattern no ordinary human could produce. The only named suspect was a woman who had vanished into the night. A woman reported to stand 6 feet 8 inches tall, weighing over 240 pounds of solid muscle. For 2 centuries, the question has lingered at the edges of local memory. Did Sarah Drummond belong to history, or to the darker place where rumor and fear become legend? The surviving documents, the sale papers, physicians' notes, eyewitness testimony, insist on a harder truth. She existed, and what unfolded in that library was the bitter, inevitable resolution of something that had been building for years. If you are drawn to the murky boundary between recorded fact and the kind of legend that settles in a landscape like silt, pause the rest of the world for a moment. Keep that feeling with you. It will be useful. Now step back with me to where this nightmare truly begins, because the tale of Sarah Drummond did not begin with violence. It began with commerce. In the spring of 1823, Charleston's port swelled with ships. Vessels from the Caribbean, from the American interior, from ports where human lives were treated like cargo. Charleston was not merely a port. It was the beating business center of the domestic slave trade, where people were counted, priced, and moved with the same clinical efficiency given to rice barrels and casks of tar. The plantations around the city, especially the rice estates, were brutal machines. Rice demanded standing waist-deep in tidal water, in swamps that bred malaria and welcomed snakes, leeches, and alligators. Mortality among those forced to work those paddies was appalling. Some historical reckonings suggest nearly 30% of newly arrived field laborers did not survive their first year. Plantation labor created a steady market for human bodies. Losses had to be replaced with purchases. Slave traders scoured the countryside seeking vigor and size, anything that might promise endurance in the Lowcountry's hellish labor. In March of 1823, a trader named Caleb Rutherford arrived in Charleston with a cough of 37 people purchased in Virginia and North Carolina. Among them was a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, who arrested attention for one unmistakable reason: she was enormous. Auction records from the time describe her as near 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and heavily muscled. Witnesses said she had to duck through doorways and that her hands could wrap entirely around a man's head. On the papers, she was recorded simply as Sarah. No surname, common practice, and one small erasure among many. She had been born on a modest farm in the North Carolina Piedmont, the child of an enslaved woman whose name, like so many others, drifted out of the record. Modern medicine would tentatively label her condition pituitary gigantism, a tumor-driven excess of growth hormone, but that diagnosis was centuries away. In Charleston, she became, in the eyes of planters and curiosity seekers, a spectacle and a commodity, a living marvel to be displayed and exploited. The auction on Chalma Street that humid March morning drew planters, merchants, and a crowd hungry for something extraordinary. When Sarah was brought onto the platform, shackled at wrists and ankles, the room quieted. She was a full head taller than the auctioneer, James Vanderhorst, a portly man who admitted later he had never seen such a specimen. The bidding began at $400, a serious sum, and climbed, fast. By the time a man in the rear called out the winning offer of $1,300, Sarah had become one of the highest-priced human chattel sold in Charleston that year.